Welcome, and welcome to our first panel discussion this morning on day 2 of Te Ara Tī. A great topic for us to get into. First of all, though, let me invite you all to introduce yourselves, especially for those who may have not already heard you, if you've already been up on stage before, in your own language as well. Ngahiwi, will begin with you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Ka nui te mihi ki a koutou, me te karaki o te ata nei, hei tūwhera tātou I rungi te wharaki o te wairua o te atua. Nō reira, tēnei te mihi. Nau mua hara mai, ngā manuhiri tuarangi, ki tēnei whenua tapu o ngā Emirati, nō reira tēnā korua, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko taku matua, I hara mai I tōna waka ko Taki Timu, I tōna wā. My father came and his people came on the Taki Timu waka. They started in Samoa, the waka was built in Samoa, travelled to Tonga, went to Fiji, down to Tahiti, Rangiatea, and then over to Rarotonga before coming to Aotearoa. That journey took 300 years. I te tau taku māma no Hamoa, no Tuwhiopa, no Apia. Ka hara mai ia I rungi te waka banana ko Maori Pōmare. But my mother comes from Samoa too, but she arrived 1,000 years later on a banana boat, Maori Pōmare. So enei aku whakapapa, ora tēnei ki a koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Tēnā koe Ngahiwi. Lexie, no mai hara mai, welcome to the panel. Your introduction, please.
Halito Sohochifo Yad Lexie Holden Chatasia. So hello everyone, my name is Lexie Holden and I'm a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma in what is now known as the United States. And I'm here representing the Intertribal Agriculture Council where I serve as the Director of Policy and Government Relations.
Tēnā koe, thank you.
Yeah,
Tēnā koe, Christine, welcome to the panel this morning. Your introduction, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Christine Sokemo Frederick. I am Cree-Métis, or Nehiau o te Pemsawak. I'm from Treaty Number 6 Territory, Edmonton, but we call it Amiskwiti Wiskaheagan. And I am the Executive Director of the Dreamspeakers Festival Society, and I work both to present as producer of Indigenous arts, but also an advocate within our funding structures as well in Canada. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou, and welcome to the panel this morning. To understand the outcomes that are being achieved by Indigenous peoples at a leadership table, it would be good for us to begin by setting some context around what representation actually looks like in your respective communities. Christine, let's begin with you.
So you're wondering, what does representation look like?
What does it look like in terms of the strength of representation being at the table? What does that look like?
Well, I'm very pleased to come from a very political and cultural family in Edmonton and in Alberta. So my grandfather was the president of the Métis Nation of Alberta in the 60s and 70s and the 80s. And my grandmother, Christine Daniels, was one of the first people to bring Indigenous programming into the city for Indigenous youth. So I come from a long line of leaders and people who were absolutely advocates and activists. In the time that I've been a professional, I have seen tremendous growth in terms of the representation. With the Edmonton Arts Council, the municipal funder, before I became chair of that board, there were 2 other Indigenous people who were on the board, but I was the very first Indigenous person to become the chair. Likewise, with the Alberta Foundation for the Arts, which is the provincial funder, I was the first Indigenous person appointed by the legislature to represent on that board. I've worked really hard since then to open the doors to Indigenous artists at various different organizations and art institutions. So the Citadel Theatre invited me to be their inaugural Indigenous Associate Artist, which is significant because it's an organization that's over 50 years old. Similarly, the first Indigenous person on the board for the Edmonton Symphony Orchestra, and lots of things like that. But I've seen specifically in the last 15 years, with the institutions opening their doors and seeing the value of Indigenous perspective, Now there are lots of people who are joining those boards, joining committees, beyond just the political sphere of things, but within many different aspects of Canadian life.
Thank you. Lexie, your experience with Indigenous representation and leadership sitting at that table?
Absolutely. So, as I said earlier, I am here with the Intertribal Agriculture Council, which was an organization founded in 1987, and we have pursued and promoted the conservation, development, and use of our natural resources and agricultural resources for the benefit of Native American people. And the Intertribal Agriculture Council represents over 80,000 Native American producers across the country, and we represent folks from all of the more than 574 federally recognized tribes. And I say all of the 574 plus federally recognized tribes because there is no monolithic Native American culture in the United States. And so one of the things that's so important to us is ensuring that there's adequate representation from each and every tribe, because while there are certainly similarities between tribes or between regions, you know, we are 574 plus sovereign nations within a nation. So we are all, you know, vastly different in terms of our resources, our communities, our values, our histories as well, and how we came to be tribes within the United States. And so it's very important to us that whenever we are given a seat at the table, that it's not just, you know, I'm speaking as a Choctaw woman, but you know, I have the stories, I have the data, I have the information and the needs that we've listened to from folks from all of those tribes, and making sure that they, you know, proverbially have a seat at the table as well to ensure that there is adequate representation across all of them.
Ngahiwi, what about Māori representation, leadership in New Zealand?
I've been the chair for Ngāti Kahungunu for 25 years. We have 8 local authorities in our area and 3 regional councils. So for 20 years there was very little Māori representation on any of them. And if there ever was, then they were elected by a largely white constituency, so they had to be the voice of the whole community rather than the Māori voice. If they did speak on Māori issues positively, they never got re-elected. But government legislation recently has forced council's hand to create Māori voices at the table, Māori seats. But this is still a stopgap measure to what we expect and what we were promised. The latest 3 waters reforms, Māori will be 50% governance. And unless you have the Indigenous voice, then that's what Plato says, democracy is ruled by the rabble. And our regions have been ruled by the barons who have made most economic gain out of native resources by confiscation and other means. So unless you hear the voice of the land and the voice of the trees and the rocks, you're never going to get a real picture of your whenua, of your people, the beating heart of your communities. So the Indigenous voice is bringing and will bring more of that too. And it'll add value to the texture of decisions that are making, rather than the scaremongering that the Māoris are going to take over.
Christine, you talked earlier about a number of firsts and roles that you have been appointed to or have assumed over a few years. And we all have different stories about not being at the table. And while it may be a negative space, I do want us to go there just briefly to better understand what it looks like when we're not at the table and our experiences in that space.
We know it's funny because when you were just saying that, I was like, well, I also have experience being under the table. Because the family that I grew up in, ignorance was not a choice. You had to know what were your rights, and I remember sitting under the table as a child while my mother and my grandparents and the other leadership within the community were talking about sovereignty and rights. But I've often told our community too that it's important to get to the table, but it's more important what you do when you're at the table. So as I said, there's been times when there have been Indigenous representation, but without that support of the community, it's hard to get a lot of things done. So I think some of the things that can happen when there isn't that representation is a gross misunderstanding of what are the needs, the wants, and the desires of Indigenous people. The narrative gets told by somebody else. So when, in the work that I've done, sometimes the very work has to be describing, defining the vocabulary that we're using. The literal words can be misunderstood when we're talking about, we need to have sovereignty, or we need to have certain rights. What does inclusion or access look like? And what I have found is that in our communities, specifically in the areas that I've been in, there's the idea that access and inclusion is enough. And without somebody there at the table pushing and describing that why that's not enough, then that's all you're going to get. And I've learned over the years that in order to grow our community, we need not only access, we need inclusion, we need to be able to identify and recognize the work of Indigenous people. Specifically for myself in the arts, we're looking at identifying the work and the craft of artists. Who are the artists? What are the actual work that they're doing, the art forms that they're doing, because that could be very limited. In fact, when I started my organization back in 2009, our provincial funder did have a stream of funding for Indigenous arts, but they only funded traditional arts, and they defined what that was. So as primarily a theater artist, I was trying to get funding for Indigenous theater, and I was told flat out, no, that's not Indigenous, by someone who is not Indigenous telling me that. And that's not okay. So yeah, so it can look like, it can look like ignorance. And I think in this world where we are now, we have to bring light to that ignorance to be able to show people that there's a breadth and a depth and a value to the work that Indigenous people are doing, that artists are bringing to the table. And in order to vocalize that and articulate it, we have to really bring a wider definition, or in some cases, a much more specific definition to people who are holding those policies, who are holding those rules and regulations to such funding.
Lexie, I noticed that you were agreeing with a lot of what Christine was just saying. In your work in policy, what is your organisation doing to empower and to enable, to support Indigenous voices to be represented?
Absolutely. And I want to first say that what you said about ignorance, I'd really like to echo that. And I'd also like to share sort of a little bit of a story. So the work that we do with our organization, the bulk of it is in partnership or sort of with the United States Department of Agriculture. Again, we are an organization for the benefit of Native American agricultural producers. However, the United States also has the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And back in the day when our organization was first started, some of our founders went to the USDA to advocate for Native producers. And they were told, you need to go over there to the Bureau of Indian Affairs because you are not, even though they are American citizens and even though that they are agricultural producers, their place was considered to be solely within the BIA rather than with all of the federal agencies of the United States. So there's this, even though we are citizens of the United States, citizens of our tribes, and citizens of the state we live in, there's still so much ignorance around what it means to be Native American and the fact that we are still endowed with the same rights that other US citizens are because we are US citizens. And so trying to, and it's challenging to teach government officials this because of course it's behooved them for hundreds of years to keep us out of these rooms, but it's so important to have to say, well, Native Americans are US citizens as well, and therefore we have the right to access these resources and access these departments just the same as anyone else. And just because we're Native doesn't mean that that's suddenly revoked from us. And I also wanted to just add very quickly that when we aren't at the table the needs of our communities aren't going to be adequately addressed. I mean, certainly there are allied organizations who work on behalf of Native Americans as well, but unless you are there to tell the story of your community, to say exactly what it is that is the problem, and to come up with solutions and be able to share those solutions with government officials or legislators or whoever it is that we're communicating with in the policy realm, you're never really going to be able to tell the story of your community and get the resources that you actually need. So often, officials will come to us and say, hey, look, we've created this program and we think it'll be great for Indian country. And they've not spoken to a single tribal leader about it, a single tribal representative, an intertribal organization, not a one. And then we look at it and it's like, oh my God, this is like really horrible. Like this is actually like very much to our detriment. Please don't do that. Really wish you had spoken to us like 6 months ago before you put so much time and energy into planning this, because this is not good. And so trying to get into those rooms to have those conversations, it's very difficult, but it's so important. And not just having a seat at the table, but being able to be the ones extending the invitation, because that means that you are in the position of power to be able to extend that invitation, to invite your people in and say, please come, you belong here. And that means that you're in those positions where you actually have a say. It's not just folks come in and present their ideas. Right. They have the final say on things as well.
Ngahiwi, when we're at the table, what are we doing? What are we achieving when we're actually there, when we do have a voice?
We're enlightening our fellow leaders about our perspective of the world, which once they get to see it through our lens, they start agreeing. Previously, it was what's good for the farmers is good for the region. Yes, yes, yes. What's good for the orchard is good for the region. Yes, yes, yes. So on and so forth. If we say what's good for the Maori is good for the region, no, no, no. They agree on everything else except sharing power with Maori, until Maori forced their way to the table. Prior to that, there was only 2 ways we could express our voice: take councils and the government to court, or ignore them and do our own thing. And they come running up after us. What are you doing? What are you doing? We're doing it without you. Just don't get out of the way. Go get in the way. So there's been a bit of a ground shift where councils, as redneck as they used to be, have suddenly seen the value of Māori voices at the table. A lot of it's got to do with Māori economic renaissance, though. We want to be part of that exponential growth in the Māori economy, which is 10 times as much as the general economy at this moment. So lots to do with economics. But once they hear the voices and the values behind the economics, then there's a gradually respect for Māori voices. And with the advent of legislation that seals Māori voices around new entities and so on and so forth, it gives us a 50% governance opportunity, but we want to take it beyond that, not just because of percentages, but because we have so much more to offer, that current systems have been tapped out, and our systems haven't been tapped in, and we have so much to offer the rest of the world, including our regions. Now, it was funny. That's why we're here at Ara Tī. There's no Indigenous voice here at Global Economic Expos. So having a voice here, it might be a tiny voice in the start, but it'll eventually grow quite exponentially, so the rest of the world so we see we add value to them.
Christine, yeah, please. Christine, as Ngahiwi mentioned, Māori and Aotearoa New Zealand have fought for everything that we have. Mm-hmm. Is that the case for you too?
Oh, definitely, definitely. We have, in my communities, there's 2 things that my mother always taught me: you lose the rights that you don't exercise. And you can't exercise them if you don't know that you have them, which is why I said ignorance was not a possibility in our family. We had to know what rights we had. I was on protest marches when I could barely walk, and like I said, sitting under the table. And there's kind of 2 things that my family taught me was that it's important to understand that you are much more than a recipient of a service. There have, in Canada, and I imagine in many places, huge industries that are developed to deliver services to Indigenous people where lots of people are making lots of money to do that. And there's a lot of defensiveness and protectiveness around those industries. And what it requires to be, and even though Indigenous people are focused as the recipients, they are not decision makers in those. And in some cases, those industries are created and crafted to keep Indigenous people subjugated. And that's not okay. And what is required to fix that or to address that is not only multiple approaches, huge complex issues and layers of industry and policy and all those things, and I'm sure you would know a lot about that. In order to address those, we also need to move away from allyship. I was once asked recently, what is like I kept talking to somebody about the need for radical solidarity. And that's a term that I learned from a gentleman who is from the Black community in Alberta, Malcolm Alzania. And I love that term. And somebody asked me, what's the difference between allyship and solidarity? Aren't they the same thing? I said, no, not at all. In the work that I've done in anti-racism and in training, allyship defines it as being someone within the dominant community who is of assistance to someone who's not dominant. And it maintains the power structures. Radical solidarity, though, helps to define what those systems are and bring them down so that we don't actually need allies anymore. We're already united as a community. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Yes, Christine.
Serene, folks, thank you for joining us. And we don't have much time left, but I'm interested to understand from your perspective what more needs to be done to ensure better representation.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here. A little bit of a schedule mix-up, so I'm just going to talk. So I think there's so much more that needs to be done. I work a lot in representation, and for many years now, there's been a complicated conversation around who should be in charge of representation, where we should be. I was raised in a really traditional home. I was raised in ceremony, but in my career, I've really focused on mainstream arts. I went to the National Ballet and Alvin Ailey and studied in mainstream arts training. And in my career now, representation is everything. So I was the first Indigenous model to be in an international billboard campaign for Canada Goose. And that was the first time an Indigenous model had been around the world on billboards. That was 4 years ago. But yes, thank you, but that was 4 years ago. That's not acceptable. And so my biggest thing is we have to be able to see ourselves in the world, to dream ourselves into the world. And so for me, with young people right now, I think there's a whole generation that doesn't even realize that they weren't seen. So with TikTok and Instagram and social media, right now there are young people who don't know what it's like to not see themselves. And so that's revolutionary. And young people are picking up their phones, they're braiding their hair, they're teaching their songs, they're engaging in ceremonial practices in a new way on their own. And I think that that's what's really needed, because for so long, we have been asked to be a culture that is just reclaiming. Just reclaiming, just reclaiming, just reclaiming. But we actually can exist in the future. And our ancestors, yes, they passed on the same songs. But guess what? Sometimes those songs with the same words may have just a slightly different rhythm. And I was adopted by a very prolific storyteller, Jim Dumont, who I call my dad now. And he was talking about a dream he had. He's close to leaving this earth now, and he's an incredible knowledge keeper. And he said he had a dream, and in his dream, he was on the East Coast, and he was watching young people dance. And he said he knew the song, and he could recognize the place, but everything was faster, and the regalia was just a little bit different, and everybody was just moving ever so slightly in a new way. And he realized that these were the young people of the future. And in that dream, we weren't exactly as we once were, but we were as we have always been. We can exist in the future. We can define who we want to be. We can have new songs. We can dream new words. We don't need to just feel like we are always picking up something that was stolen from us. We can exist knowing that we already come to this earth with everything we need. And now we just need to remember. And so I think what's missing is the idea that we can remember and that we are fully whole people, however you want to define that. And we are more than our trauma. And so representation is more than us just in recovery. It's more than just these conversations that are complex. It is also about who we will be when we are healed and how we will be when we reclaim our countries in full. Imagine, we don't have to just think about dismantling structures of colonization. What if we dismantle the whole system and then take over and restore what we always had?
Ngahiwi, are we doing enough to grow leadership, to see succession planning happening?
No, all our new leadership is growing in universities. They go to learn in universities about who we are, our own people. And we're not doing enough on the ground leadership where people come from the earth up. People are reading about us, and our own people are reading about us in textbooks written by somebody else about us. So we're not doing enough, although just using the current educational system does upraise our levels against the others, but it still doesn't uplift our own mātauranga Māori to a level of similar or even superior. So we still understate our own mātauranga, our own ways of doing things and seeing the world in order to get the certificate. Now, we used to have tohunga. Tohunga is our highest honour you can give anybody with extreme and penetrative knowledge from the old world. Today, everybody learns the same and gets a BA or BSc to a level that's nowhere near the tohunga level. So we've got to bring our people up in our world as well, if we're not doing enough about that.
Lexie, what does effective Indigenous leadership look like to you? And that's a big question. It is a big question.
I was going to say, well, we have like 10 minutes left, but okay. Effective Indigenous leadership, absolutely. So I think it's a twofold thing. One, you have to have it both within the tribes themselves, but also, or within any Indigenous community, but also within the sort of dominant culture as well. I think both of them need to exist, and they need to work in tandem with one another and work hand in hand in order for that communication pipeline between tribal nations and the federal government in the US to really, truly be effective. And what does it mean to be effective? Well, for starters, it would be, a united front, for tribal communities to know exactly what it is that's plaguing them, being able to lift up solutions proposed by their own members, being able to rebuild their communities or shape their communities in the way that they'd like to see it, to determine for themselves what they want it to look like and how they want to move through the world as a tribe. And then on the sort of more federal side of things, or the non-tribal leadership side, for those folks to also be Indigenous as well and to uplift those communities and to do whatever it is they can within the dominant culture systems to ensure that tribal folks have a seat at the table, that the needs of our tribal communities are heard, and that they're actually acted upon, and not just keep saying like, oh yeah, we'll improve tribal self-governance opportunities in 10 years. Or yeah, we'll do it now, and then the next administration comes and wipes it out, and whatever forward progress we had is gone. It really needs to be rooted in what the tribal communities themselves need and what tribal nations need, and then it has to actually get done, at the other level as well, that's a big thing to ask of the government, but, well.
Christine, you were rubbing your hands together when I asked that last question, so I'm going to ask you to briefly comment on that, but also perhaps offer a view around accountability of leadership.
Ooh.
And what that looks like.
Well, I was really stimulated right then because I remembered the words of my grandfather. And and I live those words all the time, and it is infiltrate, don't assimilate. And that is hard as a young person when you're going through school, because there's the peer pressure to assimilate. But when you become your own person, you're out on your own, your career is building, to carry that with you all the time, because that, I think, comes to where the accountability is. If you feel that urge to assimilate and you're not understanding the difference, you're infiltrating these organizations, you have a goal, maybe an agenda even, but it's much easier, and you can do it with integrity when you need to be accountable to your community. It's also something that I carry with me all the time, is that if I get through the door, if I get to the table, I'm bringing my community with me. Yeah. I'm always thinking, and there are times when things get very difficult. There are moments where it's like, well, whose side are you on? And things can become personal. And some of these truisms that I carry with me from my grandparents is be on the side of the community. I'm not on my side, I'm not on anyone's side except for the community. And again, going back to those words that we need to define, to elaborate on how we're using those words to establish good communication, is what are the ethics of every action that you're doing. And I don't mean ethics and morals and is it right or wrong, but the action that does the most good for the most people. And in my sense, for my community. And so I think in that way, I can feel like I am accountable to my people. I can reason to them. I can articulate the why I did things the way I did, and I'm never on the wrong side of that argument. And I feel very powerful in that realm. I mean, I was going to say another thing that a lot of the work that I do in the community and outside with the public, I've learned that there is something the public has that I've had to challenge, and it's cultural expectations. They have cultural expectations of Indigenous peoples, and a lot of it has to do with when we are out in the world, we're somehow representing a historical representation of our culture. And I work really hard to make sure I can power through that, challenge those cultural expectations so that the next Indigenous theater artist doesn't have to prove that they're an Indigenous theater artist. They are contemporary, they are of the now, they are of the future, and they self-determine that.
That's right. Kia ora.
Thank you.
So, Rain, talking about future leadership, and you mentioned social media earlier and the power of social media, and I really want to try and encourage a perspective around what young people look at when they aspire to become a leader. What does that look like? What does that sort of suggest to you too?
Yeah, I have to just say also, in terms of social media, all the time there's the industry of influencing. And I tell young people all the time, don't ever call me an influencer. I am an infiltrator, and that's all. Yes. I infiltrate these systems and these big businesses also, and I think that that's really important because there are a lot of conversations about where Indigenous people should be, where we should be sitting. And as an activist, I often run into conversations and questions about whether or not I should be working with XYZ, big business. And my position is firmly always that I can do more on the inside than I can from out. And if I'm on the inside, then I can be telling my brothers and sisters where they need to put the roadblock. But they won't know where that train is going and what train to stop if there's not an informant. And I think that it's, you can call that political or not, but that's the way that everyone else has been operating forever. So why aren't we operating in the same way as the people who are causing us harm? What is the future of leadership? And what does that look like, I think? So I'm also a filmmaker, and while you were talking, I don't know why this came up, but I was thinking about an opportunity that I had, I think it's 5 years ago now, where I took Justin Trudeau, our sitting prime minister, up to a reservation to deliver water. It's a place called Shoal Lake 40. It's the first time that a sitting prime minister had ever spent more than 3 hours on reserve. More than 3 hours. So, all of these things that seem like these incredible things you can't imagine if you look them up, it's like now those things have changed, but we went door to door delivering water. Shoal Lake 40 has been on a boil water advisory for more than 30 years. They are 25 kilometers from the Trans-Canada Highway, which is one of the largest highways that cuts through our country. And they don't have water because they were cut off from their system to deliver water to the city of Winnipeg, which is the capital of Manitoba, one of the largest populations of Indigenous people in our country. So that documentary didn't go viral. Nobody saw it. But around the world, New Zealand, Australia, it was programmed in festivals and people saw it. So leadership to me, when we think about content and when we think about representation, we need to be in those places. We need to be with our prime ministers. We need to be making content and films with our leaders, and we need to reimagine where we are allowed to be. And I think we need to be in politics and in social media and in art and reclaiming our stories. I think for so many of us, we know we can't just do one thing. And it's actually a luxury to be able to just exist in the world as you are, a luxury that almost no Indigenous person has. I can never make a decision without thinking of the effects of my community. I can never sign a contract without thinking, what would my community think about this? I can never stand on this stage and offer these words without having that responsibility. So we need to also be thinking about what that means for our young people, and we need to support them better. And so leadership means if we're going to train and raise up our young people to operate and to dismantle these systems, then just like our elders would have been there when the warriors come home to heal them and to provide them with safety, we need to be thinking of our young people out on the front lines in that same way. Young people who are looking up to leadership roles need to be supported by our elders, need to have people to turn to. And when the community attacks them, if that happens, we need to stand up for them because we know that that's the place that we're in. Because the young people are literally on the front doors of the revolution. And they are by themselves so often because the mediums that they're using are unknown to most of our communities. We don't know how to support them. So I know there's 20 seconds left, but I'm just gonna say, we need to find a way to be there for our young people. We are asking so much of them. We're literally asking them to start a revolution. And so let's be there on the front lines of the revolution with them, and let's sing the songs, and let's bring them home and make sure that when they come home, they still have a seat at the table and that they're not just being out there on their own. The seat at the table is in our communities too.
Thank you, and we are out of time, but I want to ask this final question to Ngahiwi, who has been a Rangatira tribal chief for many, many years now. Your hopes and aspirations for leadership?
Well, us older leaders have to learn the way of the young, and the young leaders have to learn the way of the old. If you don't have that, then we become the authors of our own recolonisation with other people's methods. So it's a two-way system, a two-way feeding, a two-way sharing.
Thank you. What a great way to leave this wonderful panel this morning. Please put your hands together for our first panel.